Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Barrons, and I'm delighted to be able to host today's Global Strategy Forum webinar, coming in this case from the Victory Services Club near Marble Arch, an appropriate venue, I think, given today's global events. This is the second GSF lunchtime webinar in March, the second actually of three. And today's event is fully online. We have said before that we would experiment with the format for these events over the coming months, and we'll continue to do that. But today's fully online, and other events will continue to be a mixture of remote and in person. Let me make a very warm welcome to our guest speaker today, Dr. Brian Klaas, who is joining us by Zoom. Brian is an assistant professor of global politics at University College London, and he is no stranger to GSF. He spoke to us before in 2018 on the subject of US foreign policy under Donald Trump, and also that same year he came back to talk about how to rig an election. We're delighted to welcome him back today, and the theme today is his new book just published, which is called Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us, which I think all of us are in no doubt is an important subject given the turmoil that we're dealing in Ukraine and indeed many other places at home and abroad. But before we start, as usual, I'm just going to run through how we're going to manage the questions and answers session, and as ever we are really hoping that as many of the members out there will contribute questions. And there are, broadly speaking, two ways to do that. The first thing is, could you please type your question into the Q&A function, and that will allow it to register here. If you are minded, and we would encourage this, to raise your question yourself, when you're invited, please unmute yourself and put your question, and it will be distributed across the webinar. If, however, you would prefer me to read your question out, just type "read" in front of your question when you send it in. The event will be recorded as ever, and you'll find it on the GSF YouTube channel, which you find on the website, which is globalstrategyforum.org. And for those of you that operate on Twitter, the event will be on GSF's account using the hashtag GSF Events Day. So I hope all of that is familiar to you now. So let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Brian Klaas. As I say, he's an assistant professor of global politics at University College London and a weekly columnist for the Washington Post. He focuses on global democracy, authoritarianism, and American politics. And he has very broad experience as a former US campaign advisor and a frequent political analyst of US domestic and foreign policy in the mainstream media outlets. His working experience includes sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and of course, United States. And his academic background includes his doctorate in politics from Oxford University, based at New College. He's a regular author for UK media, including The Guardian, Financial Times, but also Foreign Affairs, Newsweek, etc. And he's a widely published author. He's written 4 books: How to Rig an Election, which I mentioned, The Despot's Accomplice, and then, no doubt, its sequel, The Despot's Apprentice, and the most recent one, Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us, published just this January. So what we're going to do now is Brian is going to talk for about 15 minutes to introduce his subject. He and I will then have a discussion based on some questions I have whilst we gather your questions in, and then we'll devote as much of the balance of the hour as possible to the questions that you would be interested to raise. And just to set the scene for Brian, his book asks at least 4 important questions. Do worse people get power? Does power make people worse? Why do we let people control us who clearly have no business being in control? And finally, how can we ensure that incorruptible people don't get into power and wield it justly? And I imagine many of the members of the Global Strategy Forum are just having a short moment of introspection as we raise questions like that, me included. So, Brian, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for hosting me for this event. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about why I wrote this book and the questions I was trying to explore. So my academic background, I did research where I ended up in the room with some quite awful people. I mean, I interviewed former despots, war criminals, all sorts of people who had ordered torture, etc. Also former rebel leaders and indeed generals, although I must say, the generals that I mostly spoke to were in juntas and were not distinguished in the British military. Now, I will say that, the common experience that I tended to have is I would tell people when I came home what I had experienced in the room with someone who had done awful things in power. And a sort of surprising reaction came up more than once, where someone would say to me, gosh, that personality sounds just like my former boss, or the person who runs my homeowners association, or whatever it was. And so I started to think more broadly about power, not just about the sort of world that I studied in far-flung places in the Middle East and these sort of abuses of power that are quite grotesque and extraordinary, but also power in the human psyche, power and how it changes people. Is it true as Lord Acton suggested, that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely? So that was the basis of the book. And I want to sort of talk about a few angles just to kick our discussion off that I think are worth keeping in mind. The first one is that power and leadership selection is surprisingly irrational. And this is something I read about extensively during the research for this book in trying to figure out why we hand over power to certain types of people. And one of the most striking studies, it's in one of the top scientific publications in the world, and it's been vetted, replicated, et cetera. It's very solid research. Looks at how face structure and faces relate to leadership positions. So what these researchers did was they showed children a series of faces. They showed them two faces and they said, you need to pick who is going to be in charge of your imaginary ship. It's a computer simulation, a computer game. And they gave them no other information. Now, what the kids didn't know is that the two faces were not randomly selected. One of them was the winner of a French election, and one of them was the runner-up in that same parliamentary seat. And what was amazing is that overwhelmingly the kids picked the winner with no other information. And when they replicated the same experiment with adults, they found the same thing, which gives new meaning to the idea of picking people at face value, right? Now, on top of this, we also have other aspects of this where we think about how the sort of conventional wisdom is indeed that power corrupts. And most of us believe this, right? That power makes people worse. And indeed it does. The evidence suggests this, the psychology research suggests this. And in the book, I also explore the neuroscience research that shows how power actually changes your brain chemistry. There's dopamine changes and other things that happen to the chemical composition around your brain in ways that profoundly alter people's thinking and their behavior. But the story is more complicated than that. And I want to show that with a brief discussion of an experiment that's widely known, which is the Stanford prison experiment, which I think has been grossly misinterpreted for the last 5+ decades since it took place at Stanford University in the 1970s. So in case you're not familiar with this, the sort of standard interpretation of the Stanford prison experiment is that Philip Zimbardo constructs a fake prison in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University, and he randomly assigns students who have volunteered for this experiment to be either prison guards or prisoners. And lo and behold, the prison guards, once they don the uniform, quickly become monsters. They start to abuse their fellow classmates. They humiliate them. It's this sort of parable that all it takes is this little tweak, this uniform, and all of us can unleash the sort of demonic power within us. Now, what's fascinating, and I think unfortunately not well understood, is that there's another wrinkle to this story. So in 2007, some researchers from a different university decided to replicate the recruitment for the Stanford prison experiment with one small change. So they took the exact wording from the Stanford prison experiment, said, we're recruiting for people for a psychological study of prison life, and they updated it for the sort of 20th, 21st century and saw who came back. But then they did the same exact wording in a couple other college towns, and they just took out the words "for a study of prison life" and replaced them with "for a psychological study." The idea was to figure out whether people were gravitating towards the study because they wanted to be in a sort of prison experiment versus those who just wanted to be in a psychology study. And when they psychoanalyzed and did surveys and research of personality types of those who showed up for the experiment, what they found is that the people who wanted to be in the prison study were more Machiavellian, more abusive, more authoritarian in their personalities, more narcissistic, etc. And so I think we've misunderstood some of the lessons of the Stanford Prison Experiment. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the way we sort of recruit for positions of power is extremely important and underappreciated as one of the dynamics that determines who ends up in power. So we sort of focus on the people who are powerful in modern society, which I refer to as the tip of the iceberg. And we don't look at the iceberg below, which is the people who never sought power in the first place, either because they didn't want it or because they didn't think they were the kind of person who should be powerful, or they were deterred from seeking power because of the recruitment strategy. And I think this is a really, really crucial thing that's ignored in the modern world, where we just focus on who actually has made it and not those who didn't seek power in the first place. And in understanding how this actually operates, I think we need to recognize that systems are really, really important. And this is the hopeful message of the book, because it's not just that rotten people are better at getting power and better at sort of abusing others when they do. And this is, by the way, disproportionately, I'm talking about there's plenty of good people in power, but there's a disproportionate level of harm and a disproportionate level of abuse in powerful people. So when we try to understand how to fix this, how to counteract this, I focus a lot on system reform. And one area I want to talk about is the police, and how police systems make a really big difference in who ends up in uniform, depending on how they recruit. So I looked into different strategies for police recruitment around the world. One of them is the United States, which has a notorious problem with police abuse and violence. Now, I found some recruitment videos that you would not believe. They look like parodies, but they are, I assure you, real. And one of them that stood out was this place, Doraville, Georgia, a small town of 10,000 people just outside of Atlanta. Most years, nobody gets murdered in Doraville. It's a pretty low crime community. It's about the same as the national average and only 10,000 people. But when you clicked onto the Doraville website a couple of years ago, what you were greeted with was this video in which they first off flashed the logo of the Punisher, a comic book vigilante character who tortures criminals when he catches them. The next thing that happens in the video is a series of police officers in combat military fatigues scream into view in a tank, get out of the tank's hatch, throw some hand grenades and smoke grenades, and then shoot their weapons, get back into the tank, and drive off. And then it shows the Punisher logo again, and that's the recruitment video for the police, right? And you have to imagine who signs up when you see that video. The person who's the community support officer, the person who's a public servant, turns away. The person likely who's a woman or who's a minority, less likely to join, because everybody in the video is an extremely gung-ho white man carrying a weapon. Now, New Zealand recognized this fact, and the Metropolitan Police have done some aspects of this too, but New Zealand has really gone quite far in the other direction in a way that's, I think, a model for understanding how recruitment can be very effective. So what they have launched is a series of viral videos. They were very funny, and they were viewed extensively across New Zealand, in which they start with a different model of policing. First off, the demographics of people who are characterized in the videos are extremely diverse, not exactly the stereotypes of who you think of as police officers. And they're chasing an unseen criminal. And as they chase them, they sort of stop and they help someone cross the street. They dance with someone in a field. And they finally capture the perpetrator that you haven't seen in this entire video. And it says on the screen, "Do you care enough to be a cop?" as they show that the perpetrator that they've been chasing is a border collie who's stolen a handbag, right? There's another video they use called Hungry Boy, in which they have hidden cameras to see if people stop to help a child who's clearly malnourished walking around the streets of Auckland. And the implication is, if you would stop for this kid, you should become a cop. And lo and behold, what happened was the applications shot up. The types of personalities that applied for the job were much more diverse, as were the applicant pool in terms of ethnic and gender dimensions. The relationship between the community, especially the Maori indigenous community, and the police officers improved, and it was a virtuous cycle. And I think the lesson here is that there's something really profound about recruitment that's extremely simple to implement. You get people who think that they look like the kind of power seeker that is depicted in the recruitment strategy. Now, we're always going to have, regardless of what kind of recruitment we have, we're always going to have some level of abuse in positions of power. So what do you have to do to counteract that? And this is where I think we have to understand how key accountability is, particularly when it's visible. So there's a great study that I talk about in the book where these researchers, these economists, look at a natural experiment with, believe it or not, United Nations diplomats and their illegal parking habits. So more than 2 decades ago, diplomats in the United Nations in New York didn't have to abide by any sort of rules, really, because they had diplomatic immunity. So they could park their cars illegally and there was no fine associated with it. They didn't have to pay. Now, by 2002, Mayor Mike Bloomberg, the mayor at the time, had gotten fed up with this because, believe it or not, they had 150,000 parking tickets to the tune of $18 million racked up by these diplomats. So he said, look, I can't fine you, I can't violate diplomatic immunity, but I can take your cars away. I'm going to impound them if you keep parking illegally. So what you see is the data is really, really interesting for showing how cultures of corruption around positions of power interact with accountability. So before they enforced this, what you saw was sort of what you'd expect. The people who were from the so-called clean countries, the sort of uncorrupt countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Japan, Germany, etc., didn't really park illegally very much. There was, an average of less than 1 parking violation per diplomat. If you look at the countries with notorious cultures of corruption, we're talking the Egypts of the world, 190 parking tickets per diplomat on average, right? So some people are well above that. And then when they started enforcing it, overnight, literally overnight, the Egyptians, the Yemenis, et cetera, started parking like the Norwegians and the Japanese. It just completely switched. And so I think there's this lesson here that, of course, cultures, systems matter enormously, but also the accountability matters enormously. And this also is resonated with this sort of a hybrid of these two lessons. With this other study I love, where they had students in India roll dice. And they rolled the dice 42 times, and then they reported their own scores. And when they reported a 6, they got paid cash. So they could lie. They self-reported so they could lie. But using statistical methods, you could figure out if someone's lying. Indeed, one student had the brazenness to report a 6 42 times in a row out of 42 dice rolls in the hope that he'd get paid. Kudos for boldness, not exactly the most convincing move in my opinion. But anyway, the point was that they then surveyed the students and they figured out what their career ambitions were. And in India, where the civil service is notoriously corrupt and there's opportunities for graft and bribery, the students who misreported their scores, who lied about the 6s, disproportionately wanted to go into the government civil service. When they repeated the study in Denmark, the results were flipped. All of the students who self-reported honestly wanted to go into the civil service, and the students who were lying wanted to go into different fields that were more lucrative with opportunities for cash to be made. So I think the lesson here is that rotten systems really do attract rotten people, and good systems attract good people. So your reform has to not just focus on recruitment, it has to focus on the system that they will eventually inhabit as well. Now, to conclude today, I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about before we open up to discussion and questions is to say, my understanding of the sort of average person's view of people in leadership is quite dismal. Most people I talk to are disappointed with the people when they look up in a hierarchy. And this is not true across the board, right? We have plenty of sectors that have great cultures, lots of accountability, lots of oversight, and really great people gravitating towards those positions of power. But by and large, when I talk to people, they're sort of like, do we really have the best and brightest among us who are at the top of our society? And my answer to them is always that occasionally in a system, you're going to get lucky. In global events right now, Ukraine got lucky. Vladimir Zelensky is behaving exactly like you would hope a leader would behave. But nobody knew that he would behave this way until he was tested. And so you can't really just sort of bet on getting lucky. My argument instead is that instead of waiting for these sort of Cincinnatus-like figures, these people who relinquish power willingly, who are in it for the right reasons, you need to engineer systems that produce Cincinnatus-like figures, that produce Zelensky-like figures much more often. And that's not impossible. In fact, as I argue in the book, this is something that isn't rocket science. It just requires the fact of us shifting, the sort of strategy is of us shifting from an autopilot strategy where we recruit the way we always did into one that's proactively trying to counteract some of the human impulses around power, like the police in New Zealand did, and understanding that power can be corrosive and trying to figure out ways to ensure that people, once they obtain powerful positions, stay on the straight and narrow. And I'm very cognizant before we move into discussion and Q&A that I'm speaking to an immensely powerful group. So rest assured that I'm not speaking about you or your colleagues. I'm talking about the disproportionate effect of the sort of bad apples that manage to wiggle their way into power and the ways that we can counteract that in the future to make a more just and equitable society. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to be in discussion with you, General Sir Barron.
Thank you. You covered a lot of ground there. I noticed that you'd recently written in the, I think in the Atlantic, and you've tweeted about President Putin and the current predicament. And obviously the world is in a very different place now from the place we imagined we might have been a month ago. So what's your view on how we ended up with Putin and what should we be doing about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a few things to think about with Putin that relate to my world of expertise. The first thing is obviously that rotten systems attract rotten people. I mean, this is a clear case of that, right? I mean, taking power after the sort of lawlessness when the oligarchs were buying up assets in the 1990s, Putin coming out of the KGB, this is a recipe for somebody who's powerful and also corrupted by power, perhaps corruptible to begin with. Now, I think one of the important things, and this I do talk about in the book in terms of decision-making, is the information environment around somebody like Vladimir Putin. And that's what my piece in The Atlantic is about. I call it the dictator trap. So, in democracies, one of the major benefits we have is that you get good feedback loops when you make mistakes. People criticize you. They tell you before you make a mistake that might not be a good idea. In Vladimir Putin's Russia, 2 decades on, the people who told Vladimir Putin that he was making a stupid mistake, they are no longer in the service of Vladimir Putin. They get purged. And a lot of the people who are around him who probably thought Ukraine was a mistake didn't tell him that because they feared that they might be, their family might get pushed off a balcony, quite frankly. I mean, it's a very dangerous place to stand up to a dictator. And so my other worry around this is that then you have the world in which Putin has constructed a fake reality in order to stay in power to convince his people of something that is fundamentally not true, right? That, for example, that no war is happening, that it's a peacekeeping operation, that Ukraine is an existential threat, or that it's a Nazi state presided over by a Jewish president. These lies exist around people in power sometimes who are megalomaniacs to serve as a loyalty test. Xenophon once said that tyrants can never know whether they're actually loved or not. And so what despots actually do usually is they construct loyalty tests that require people to lie on behalf of the regime. And those people who lie willingly for Putin have proven that they're loyal. So, my worry in this situation is that he's getting very bad advice, very bad information. He's believed his own propaganda, which is, in my opinion, why he's miscalculated. And that's why when we think about the end game, I'm profoundly pessimistic because I don't think he's a rational actor at the moment. I think he's proven that by this invasion. And therefore, some of the stuff that we think might be a reasonable offer to get him to end the invasion may or may not be something that he's willing to accept and back down. So those are sort of my thoughts. I don't know where it's going to go from here, but I am deeply worried that his behavior has been highly irrational and not the kind of savviness that some people have chalked up to Putin in the past.
Yeah, and interesting that polling suggests 60% of Russians support the war and support Putin. So we're clearly having an issue with more than just the president of Russia. So if I may, let's go to the other end of the spectrum and the United States, which you're very experienced in. And the US Constitution creates these checks and balances between the legislative, executive and judicial arms of power, and they have universal suffrage for election to Congress and the presidency. And yet, US politics appears to be deeply polarized and personalized, and this is beginning to call into questions even the US's democratic credentials. So what do you think is going on there, and how might it all turn out or be made better?
Yeah, it's the huge question of our times, really, because the US has shown itself to be flirting with a move towards authoritarian style politics in some ways as well. The January 6th events were horrific to watch. What I think I'm profoundly worried about is that becoming a politician has become deeply unattractive to normal, decent people who want to serve their communities. And this is the polarization you spoke about. I mean, one of the reasons on a personal level, one of the reasons I became a political scientist in the first place, got interested in politics, was because when I was 8 years old, my mom ran for the local school board. She just wanted to help the school district improve. And the things that she had to deal with were pretty minor. I mean, you'd have a union dispute. You'd have occasionally a parent who would be upset that evolution was being taught in a biology class. But it was manageable. It was fine. It was something where if you wanted to serve, you could. What I'm seeing in the US now at the local level is people who are on the school boards who will implement, for example, public health advice in schools are facing death threats. They're facing harassment. Their children face harassment by people who stalk their houses and so on. And one of the things that I think is really worrying about this is that these people then trickle up into becoming the national politicians. I mean, you think about running for Congress in the United States, it is a vile place to be at the moment. I mean, it's a place that's extremely toxic in the sort of dynamics within the halls of Congress. You have to raise money constantly, and you're almost certainly going to have a security detail of some sort if you become prominent. And this is something that I think weeds out some of the better leaders who just don't want power. I mean, this is one of the angles that I argue is that there's a Douglas Adams quote that I particularly like. I'm a huge Douglas Adams fan. He says, anyone who can get themselves made president should on no account be allowed to do the job. I'm paraphrasing basically. But I think this is one of those aspects about modern American politics is I think that's quite true in the moment, given how toxic it is. I don't know how it's going to end. What I think will be really important to watch, though, are the midterms, because historically the president's own party loses a lot of seats in the midterms, and Biden will be effectively ineffective. Sorry, that's a very poor phrase. He will be made completely ineffective if his party, the Democrats, are removed from control of the House and the Senate, because he won't have any ability to pass domestic legislation. He's already very limited in doing that because of the razor-thin margin that the Democrats control the Senate with. But the midterms are likely to not go very well for Biden. It's slightly improved for him because the war in Ukraine has elevated his position. He's rebounded in the polls. And I think the other big question is whether Biden runs in 2024 because of his age and other factors, whether there'll be a Democratic challenger. So, I think the fabric of democracy in the US is fraying, and those two elections and the ways that they sort of unfold and whether there's violence around them will be very, very important markers of whether this is going to turn itself around or not.
So thank you. So Brian, before I put another question to you, just a reminder for the ladies and gentlemen of the GSF to please put their questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. And if you want to put it to yourself, then we'll do that. And if you want me to read it out, just put read in front of your question. And on the basis that I am clearly a psychopath, this conversation is going to take a dark turn unless the Q&A function starts to fill up with better questions. So I'm now going to take you to China, because there was a thought that as China grew more prosperous, it would inevitably become more, I suppose, liberal and democratic. But if anything, that prosperity has cemented the grip of the party, 92 million members, and the primacy of the state over the individual, and there's a cultural aspect to that. But unlike Western political parties, getting into the Chinese Communist Party requires selection, effort, supervision, development, in order to become genuinely seen itself as an elite. And about 1 billion people seem really happy with that. So on the basis of your research, does this suggest that China has a better way of taking people attracted to power and training them and organizing them than democracies?
No, is the short answer to that. But I'll elaborate in a few ways. The first thing that I'm worried about is that this mystique of sort of Chinese-style leadership is being used to justify awful leadership in other parts of the world. So when I do field research in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there are systems in which autocrats and authoritarians point to China and say, look, they have high levels of economic growth. We don't need elections. Now, what they don't point out is that China has a functioning bureaucracy. It has the institutions of state, and some of these places that I've been doing fieldwork in don't have those. So they sort of justify authoritarianism by pointing at China without actually doing the legwork to build the things that have made China's economic growth to be successful. Now, in China itself, I think one of the problems is authoritarianism looks stable until it collapses, right? I mean, this is one of the lessons that I think we've learned the hard way over and over and over again. You have the sort of belief in the Arab strongman before the Arab Spring. All of a sudden, Ben Ali is seemingly ensconced, invincible in power, and in the span of a week, he's gone. Then it sort of ripples into the rest of the Middle East, and a series of dictators collapse at the same time. I think the same is happening with Russia, where there's a lot of accommodationists who sort of thought, Putin's our guy. He's not our guy, but he's somebody who we can work with, right? We'll just sort of try to get him to tone down a little bit of the rough edges and be somebody that the West can partner with. Germany certainly thought this for far too long, in my opinion. So my view of China is sort of similar. I mean, it's one of these countries where it's had remarkable economic growth. It's been sustained. What happens when that stops? What happens when that slows down? What happens if the West is genuinely serious, as it appears to be, at dividing the world between autocracies and democracies? I think there's going to be profound geopolitical shifts that happen as a result of the war in Ukraine. And China is probably quite nervous about a world in which deglobalization starts to happen, and the sort of export-led growth that they've relied on for a long time. They understand that it could potentially change depending on how they behave, for example, with an invasion of Taiwan. So I think you also get the same sort of miscalculation in a place like China, where you can't speak freely. The CCP may end up having a way to train bureaucrats and future leaders in sort of the Chinese dogma, but it doesn't have a way to sort of encourage freedom of thought and therefore the creativity that comes with democratic leadership. So I think, these sort of the veneer of stability, the veneer of growth that's everlasting, I suspect in China at some point will grind to a halt. And when that happens, the crucial question will be, what do those 1 billion people who are okay with the bargain so long as the growth comes, what do they do then next? And that's a question that will define the 21st century, I suspect.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions now, and then they're linked and about technology. And the first one is about social media. And I'd be interested in your view in what role you think that social media plays in the personal decisions people make to run for office, whether it's in government or indeed in the wider public or even private sector, because of the exposure that MPs and others get to this online abuse, particularly women. Is this putting good people off, or is it narrowing the field to some really odd people?
I love this question because you've framed it very, very well. So there's obviously a situation in which people who are drawn to power for the right reasons look at the abuse, the hate they get from social media, and start to think maybe it's not worth it. And I will speak from personal experience, although it's much, much worse for people who are in the media, who are women, facing lots and lots of sexualized abuse and so on that they get. But I when I go on CNN, for example, or MSNBC, I will semi-routinely get death threats. I mean, it's just for talking about politics. That's the state of American democracy at the moment. And it's of course bled into other contexts that are perhaps slightly less polarized, but it's still a very dangerous place to be, and an uncomfortable one. Now, the flip side of that, though, is that it's actually an attraction for all of the wrong kinds of people. So the people who just want power for fame and glory, and because they want to sort of get lots of exposure, maybe end up as a media host themselves, those people are making a beeline to fill out the form to run for office. And that's what you're seeing right now. This is what's really worrying to me in the modern Republican Party, is that there used to be a level of control that the party had over who became the party's star, so to speak, the person who's like up and coming, poised to become the next leader of the party. And think about Mitt Romney, for example. Mitt Romney is someone who put his time in, ascended through the Republican ranks, and was the nominee, the Republican nominee for president. He is now a pariah in the Republican Party because he sort of briefly stood up to Donald Trump over impeachment. So who are the stars that replace him? There's a few new people who are really exciting the Republican base, and they're the kinds of people who engage in extremism online. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has since been expelled from Republican committee assignments, has a massive social media following. She supported the QAnon conspiracy theory at one point. She says outrageous stuff. She attributed I'm not making this up. She attributed a wildfire at one point to Jewish space lasers. This is the kind of person who breaks out online because there is an incentive structure by which extremism and outdoing the people who are already extreme makes you get noticed. And the more that politics becomes a sort of attention-seeking role rather than a public service role, the more you get narcissistic attention seekers to run for office. So I think we've underestimated, even though we talk about this a lot, I think we've actually still underestimated how much social media is warping positions of power, particularly along politics, and creating a pipeline of people who are willing to deal with the abuse on the one hand, want the attention on the other, and simply think that power is a vehicle for exposure as opposed to a vehicle for service. So I think this is something we have to think much more carefully about, and parties should probably put some restrictions, not necessarily heavy-handed ones, but sort of guidelines to say this is the way you should use social media responsibly, so that you don't have this sort of ratcheting effect of trying to break out by being more extreme and pandering to the party base, a dynamic that's particularly corrosive in the United States at the moment.
I think you've tackled the second part of that question, which is, given that every adult has a vote and a smartphone in many places now, is there a way that we can use that digital age technology to improve the sort of accountability that we might require?
Yeah, there is a role for digital technology. Now, it's not. I'll tell us a brief study and anecdote that relates to this point, but it's not specifically related to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene in our politics in Western countries. But there's certainly ways in which technology can improve oversight. A very simple one, anti-corruption tool in India, is that a place of graft used to be driving tests, right? Lived experience with corruption. And all they did was install sensors on the cars, and it made it so that you when you were parallel parking, you either were in the lines or you weren't, and they could no longer extort a bribe and say, you look a little bit out over the line to me, but maybe you could, pay me a little bit of cash and I'll pass you. So there's a role for technology for oversight. One thing that I think we should use more of is random oversight for people who are particularly in professions that are prone to abuse. I spoke to the former head of internal affairs at the NYPD, the New York Police Department in New York City. And one of the things he designed was this integrity test where they would set up fake crime scenes where there'd be, say, $20,000 of cash on the table and some cocaine in bags. And the police officer would be told to sort of secure the crime scene while backup arrived. And they didn't know that these crime scenes, these fake crime scenes, were, lots of video cameras, lots of microphones, et cetera, to see what the cop would do. And if they, say, pocketed $6,000 and reported $14,000, they would be led away in handcuffs or fired. And what was fascinating about this is they did 500 integrity tests. When they actually surveyed the police officers and said, were you subject to a randomized integrity test this year? 12,000 police officers said, yes, I was. I went to a fake crime scene. What that meant was that 11,500 police officers went to real crime scenes that they thought were a setup. And I think that limited level of oversight, the sort of striking the fear that you might be being watched a little bit using technology, can be very, very effective in deterring abuse. You don't want to do this in most contexts, right? We don't want the workplace refrigerator to be wired up to see if anyone's stealing your lunch. But we do think, I do think it's a valuable idea in those places where abuse in positions of consequential power are particularly worth having oversight.
Thank you. So we've got a very interesting question from Jeremy Greenstock, and he's going to ask this live in person. So Jeremy, if you could unmute and please put your question.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. I'm really asking you, Professor, where is the mean between too much power and too little power? If you look at the EU for a moment, some people would say it's fatally flawed because it's run by committees rather than by an apex leadership that has power concentrated in a usable way. And that's an example of perhaps where there's too little hard power available to a very important institution. Where is that mean between too much and too little?
It's a great question. So this is one of those areas where social scientists take a sort of common sense answer and dress it up with a fancy sounding jargon. It's called the Goldilocks effect that we talk about often in social science, where you want just enough, right? Just the right amount of power. I think you're right to point out that you need to be able to delegate and be able to sort of have the latitude to act I mean, we confer power on people because we want them to act on our behalf. If they're completely hamstrung and they can't do that, there's no point in having this hierarchy where we delegate power. On the flip side, concentrating power without oversight is a crucial error. So my view on this is that there is a sweet spot. You want to have and you can actually increase the level of power that you're willing to delegate to people if you fix the systems themselves. So in other words, what I would say in a sort of Western context is that you could delegate with slightly less oversight, slightly less accountability, because presumably a lot of the institutions are, broadly speaking, drawing in people who are not about to, order torture on other individuals. Whereas in systems where there's much more latitude and much more abuse and a culture sort of using power for nefarious means, you're going to need to redesign the system in a way that there's a lot more checks and balances. So, it's a function of how well you recruit, how well you constrain, and how well you create a culture of good power. When you do all those things right, then I would be in favor in those situations of having a lot more delegation and a little bit less oversight. And so, it's a sort of trade-off where you have to think about what your actual problem is. As you're highlighting the EU, perhaps the problem is not the sort of accountability, perhaps it is actually the ability to enact policies once they have been agreed. And I would agree broadly with that characterization.
Thank you. So I'm now going to read out a question, but it's a question that will require you to tell a bit of a story to fill it in. And the question comes from Frank Demoni, apologies if I've pronounced that wrong, and he says, in your book, which is the book we're talking about today, you describe how the leader of Madagascar, Ravalomanana, was removed in a coup. To get rid of a bad leader, do we have to do a Ceausescu Christmas, or do we need to wait for the French armoured divisions?
What a way to phrase it. So the story that he's referring to in the book, it's in the introduction. One of the people that I had the interesting experience of meeting, I've actually met with him 6 or 7 times, is the former president of Madagascar, Marc Ravalomanana. The brief background to this is that he grew up extremely poor, selling yogurt off the back of his bicycle, and soon became, with a lot of hard work and a modest loan, the yogurt kingpin of Madagascar, the richest man on the island, and eventually the president. He was elected in the early 2000s. The reason I talk about him in the book is because he's this classic case of power corrupting. He starts off this sort of rags to riches story. He sets up an anti-corruption unit. He seems to be someone who's willing to sort of tackle these endemic problems in Madagascar. Then over time, as he gets into his second term, he tries to lease half of the arable land in Madagascar to a South Korean company for personal profit, and also registers the Madagascar national airplane, which he somewhat grandiosely calls Air Force Two, to his personal name as opposed to the state. So inevitably, he gets overthrown in a coup by, believe it or not, a 34-year-old radio DJ, who is, by the way, currently the president of Madagascar. Now, the point about this sort of aspect of the coup and the question, how do we get rid of bad leaders, is one that's so difficult. And it's one of the things I try to tackle in the book, because you have a situation where a lot of the reforms are involving, turkeys voting for Christmas, so to speak. It's a situation where the people who have benefited from the system being broken are unlikely to repair it if it means them losing their job. Now, the caution that I would say about coups, and this is from experience doing work in places like Thailand and Madagascar, et cetera, is that it is sometimes the only way. It is true, this is the case, because if the dictator has stacked the deck so much that the ordinary people can't possibly protest, would have to potentially get killed in order to go to the streets, et cetera, you may not be able to have a fair fight. And in those moments, there are occasionally coups. The cautionary tale, I would say, is that in speaking to leaders who have been in countries that have had coups in the past, it doesn't just change the leadership structure, it changes the way they wield power. So if you have just come to power in a coup, you know very, very clearly that the same thing can happen to you. And what it does is it warps your decision-making. So you discount the role of the population and you amplify the happiness of the generals, the military, the soldiers around you. You start to pay soldiers more. You start to rotate generals perhaps to make sure that none of them amass a power base where they can actually challenge you. And it creates this warped effect that ultimately makes you govern very poorly. And that leads to more coups. So when I did my PhD research and I was looking at the causes of coups, the number one predictor, this is not rocket science, but it's just an important thing to highlight. The number one predictor of a coup is the presence of a past coup within the last 5 years. That's the most strongly significant statistical predictor of future coup risk. So to my mind, it's something where you sort of have to be careful what you wish for, because you often will end up trading a tyrant for a tyrant in a uniform. And that's not always necessarily that much better. So you do often get better outcomes when the toppling of a dictator is more organic in the form of an uprising, but that can also go very badly if there is a lot of bloodshed around it. So there's not a great answer, but I do think that sometimes at crucial moments, you mentioned the French military, at crucial moments, foreign powers can play a role. In Cote d'Ivoire, for example, where I did research at one point, the former despot rejected the election results and tried to stay in power. And the French military they basically intervened in a way where they said, we're enforcing the election results. We're not trying to take over the country, but we're just enforcing the election transfer of power. And lo and behold, that's what happened. So at those crucial moments, there is perhaps a limited role for intervention to maintain and preserve democracy in those situations.
Thank you, Archer. As a soldier, I'm pressed to think of any circumstances in which Her Majesty's government ever really amplified my happiness, but we must live in hope, probably. So, an anonymous question. Now, you described in your introduction, and it features largely in the book, how essentially our Stone Age brains make us cleave to the attractive and the assertive, possibly giving the lie to the thought that politics is showbiz for the ugly. But if the case, is democracy fatally flawed until we manage to develop our intellectual capacities to overcome this biological baggage? Or to put it another way, can you think of democracies that have overcome this problem of people going for the attractive and the assertive over the able?
Well, I have quite a Churchillian view of democracy on this one front, which is to say that it's the worst form of government except for all the other types. So there are deep flaws with democracy, but I do think it's the best thing that exists. Now, when it comes to the strongman aspect and the sort of Stone Age brains, just for people who aren't familiar with this comes from this idea of what's called evolutionary mismatch. And the idea is that our brains have not evolved significantly in the last 50,000 years. So we basically have the same brain structure as hunter-gatherers several tens of thousands of years ago. And what was adaptive back in that time, in other words, in order to survive, in a moment of crisis, it was rational to turn to a strong male figure, a strong man. And therefore, this has been borne out by psychology research in the modern day, when there are moments of crisis, when you ask people to select leaders in situations in which there's a war or a famine, there's a pandemic, they do tend to gravitate towards physically larger, taller men. So this effect has been shown, replicated in various studies and so on. Now, we also have evidence, by the way, US presidents, notoriously, there's lots of evidence that taller presidents tend to win, et cetera. They make more money. The list goes on. Now, I think that this is also one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin poses shirtless, and also why he potentially creates crises, because the template in the brain is much more powerful in those existential moments, and also when the leader is reminding you of those things. It is, by the way, completely irrational. I mean, it's you can think of no other profession in which you would try to pick someone on the basis of whether they looked powerful shirtless. I mean, you imagine if your dentist did that, it would be time to change dentist. So the question about how we solve this problem, I don't think it is solvable, but I do think it is something that we can turn the mirror back on ourselves in our own society and think about, why do we give certain types of people power? We don't talk about that enough. We talk about the politicians who end up getting power, and we don't think about, why is it that we have been drawn to this person? And I think that is where this research is supposed to fill the gap a bit. It's to say, and it's not my research alone, it's loads of people in psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and anthropology who are pointing to the fact that a lot of the biases that we have around leadership selection are completely irrational and can be counteracted if you acknowledge them. So I think the first step is to sort of highlight the fact that there's something going on in our heads when we decide who to vote for that isn't always what we think it is in terms of our explanation for why we voted for someone. And that, to me, is a critical point to get across to those who are casting ballots, because it will hopefully lead to a bit more introspection in society about why we occasionally like the person who entertains us rather than governs us well, or the person who seems strong, even if they're not going to be effective.
Thank you. So we're going to try another live question, and this is from Billy from Crisis Action. So Billy, if you'd like to unmute and put your question.
Yes, thank you. Beyond the dumb luck of electing good leaders, how do you think we can motivate the necessary systemic changes under these present conditions, where we have material interests and institutional cultures that are invested in maintaining this corruption, and we have informational manipulation which limits the public will and awareness of the situation?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So in the book, I argue in favor of this process that's aimed at exactly this. And it derives from this idea that has its roots back in ancient Greece with a device called the claritarion, where a citizen assembly was elected basically by lot. It was randomly selected of the citizens, sort of like jury duty. And this idea is called sortition. Now, I don't think that sortition is a good idea on its own. I don't think we should replace politicians with randomly assigned people from the public, because the complexity of modern politics is such that you need to actually become an expert. You don't want to have a random selection of people negotiating a nuclear test ban treaty, right? But, and this is the sort of caveat here, I think that the process of sortition can be used for oversight. So I propose creating shadow boards in companies and shadow parliament, for example, in the UK, where you get a group of, let's say, 650 randomly allocated citizens, you put them in a chamber, you pay them for a year, and you give them access to exactly the same information, exactly the same decisions to make as the real parliament or the real board of directors for a company. They wouldn't have any binding power. What they would do is they would expose when a politician or a company is acting for reasons that are at odds with how the sort of ordinary person might think about the problem, which doesn't mean they have to change course. It just forces the question. So if you're awarding a contract to someone based on, your sort of relationship with them, the sortition-based group, the shadow parliament, wouldn't do that. If you're making a decision that is deeply at odds with the way the rest of the world or the rest of the people in your country think, then that will be exposed, and it will provide an angle for journalists to question people. Why aren't you doing what these people, given the same information, sort of came up with as a common sense solution? So it's not to replace the politicians, it's just to sort of hold them more accountable in a way that will reduce corruption and provide that sort of cudgel to say, wait a minute, you've given out a contract to someone who has absolutely no experience because they're your friend. The group of people that we randomly selected did not do that. Can you answer this on the sort of Sunday talk shows? And I think that's one of the ways, I talk about 9 other solutions in the book, but that's one of the ways that I think we could start to put pressure on people to actually enact reform and to hold them accountable.
Thank you. So just going to change the direction a bit. We're going to talk about effectiveness and leadership. And I'll use the example of the fact that we're being reminded now about war in the raw, its true feral nature, just this aspect of the human condition. And when you're dealing with things like a war where there's no script, there's no guarantee, there's no safety net, and it requires an enormous will to win and to find your way through successfully. Might it be the case that the sort of person who is attracted to power for power's sake is actually better at leading in these conditions than someone who is perhaps more equivocal about the use of power? Is there a balance to be struck between effectiveness and altruism?
Yes. So, I think it depends on what the war is supposed to accomplish. This is one of those arguments, by the way, that goes into the world of evolutionary anthropology that says that, in the past, if you were trying to win a war of conquest, just absolute dominance, then perhaps it was a rational thing to gravitate towards a Machiavellian psychopath, because that person might be extremely effective, not just in committing the war and sort of executing it, but also in making people understand that they were an irrational actor who is willing to go further than anybody else. Now, in the modern world, most wars have constraints put on them. And I'm not trying to suggest that the Ukraine conflict is one that has had, massive constraints put on Putin, because it is, of course, extremely bloody and horrific. But if Putin wanted to destroy Ukraine, he could have done it in a variety of different ways. And so he's playing all also in the sort of realm of public opinion. And in that realm, I think you don't want somebody who is willing to sort of go the extra brutal mile in order to show that they're committed to winning the conflict, because that's what's happened with Putin, right? Is he's shown a level of brutality that may be effective, at least in terms of creating destruction, but has backfired enormously in the sort of strategic interests that he was trying to advance. I mean, in the court of public opinion, he has absolutely cemented his legacy as a murderous tyrant. He has ensured that Russia is extremely, extremely isolated in a way that will wreck the Russian economy, probably for many, many years to come, if not for a generation, if they stick on this current path. So, I think there is something to that idea of when you're going for a scorched earth strategy, perhaps the absolute worst among us may be the right person to be in charge in that environment. But thankfully, the structures of geopolitics have meant that scorched earth wars, for the most part, come with costs. And therefore, I think the sort of savvy statesman in a democracy is often a better choice when it comes to conflict.
Thank you. So we've got time, at least I think, for one more question. And I'm going to take one about UK politics. You're an American academic living and working in the UK and a keen observer of UK politics and will therefore track the conversations about should MPs be paid more, should they be provided with better staff, does the way the House of Commons operate in terms of its procedure, is that fit for the 21st century, and what should we do about the House of Lords and arguably how do we manage devolution? So if we are interested in attracting incorruptible people into power in the UK, what specific things would you think we should look at or do in order to improve the chances of that working well now and into the future?
It's such an important question. So I think there's a few things that we have to think about. The first is I wish that political parties spent more time and effort on recruitment of people with a track record of public service and integrity, rather than waiting for a self-selection effect to play out. What we mostly do now is we say, who wants to run? Who wants to be an MP? And I think what would be a much more effective strategy is to shift the balance a bit more towards effectively headhunting leaders who have proven that they will behave well when they have power. That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, when you talk about things like pay, you need to make power attractive to people. So we need to have a political environment where it's not an absolutely dystopian world to be a public figure. You also need to have a political environment where you can actually make a decent amount of money when you're in public service, so that you want to be attracted to that. Now, on the flip side of that, you can go a little bit too far on that and make it so people who are motivated by money or power rather than public service gravitate towards the job. And this example I'll draw from across the pond, but it applies certainly to the UK as well, which is there was a discussion, or there's an ongoing discussion in the US Congress about banning members of Congress from individually trading stock without having to put their assets in a blind trust of any sort. And one of the reasons this came about was because at the beginning of the pandemic, some members of Congress offloaded loads of stocks right before the pandemic struck, because they got a private briefing about how calamitous the pandemic was likely to be for global markets, which wasn't illegal at the time. And they did an investigation and they said there was no wrongdoing. Now, one of the most amusing things to me was the reaction to the proposal that said we're going to ban individual members of Congress from trading stock directly. Was a series of Republican members of Congress said, well, this is going to make it unattractive to run for office. I mean, there's a balance here, because perhaps that's true, but to my mind, if the people who are being self-selected out of the process are the ones who think, I'm not going to be able to get as rich as I thought I was going to be able to get in running for office in the US Congress, perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps it's a screening test of whether you're in it for service and public duties, or whether you're in it to get rich based off the fact that you're going to have highly connected investment opportunities. So to me, there's a real balancing act you have to strike. You don't want to make power so attractive financially that people go into it for the wrong reasons, but you need to make it competitive so that people end up in power and thinking that it's actually worth their time, rather than devoting their careers to other more lucrative professions. So again, it's one of these Goldilocks solutions, not particularly precise, but it's something that I think has to be discussed in the parliament in a sort of democratic way. I will say, by the way, that the UK does something really, really well. And that is that people who are in power are regularly held to account in prime minister's questions. I wish we had this in the US. The scenes of Donald Trump having to face something like PMQs would have been amazing on their own. But beyond that, you also have a real built-in accountability mechanism where ministers have to answer for what they're doing in the public eye. And I think that's a very, very positive thing and a healthy sign of a democracy that's well designed.
So we're just about out of time. And if I give you 30 seconds, other than urging us to rush out and buy the book, which you can take as a given, what would you want us to remember from today?
Well, I'm speaking to lots of powerful and influential people, and I'd say, just use your power to help recruit the next generation effectively. It's crucial that the pipeline is a pipeline of people who are good and decent and have a track record of integrity. And it's not difficult to do this. It just needs a lot of thought by people who are in positions like yourselves on how you can make the world just that little bit better with that sort of pipeline of better future leaders. So thank you very much for having me and for listening to my remarks today.
Well, and thank you for writing the book and for coming on today to talk about it. So we're out of time. The next GSF event is on the 22nd of March, as usual, 1 to 2 p.m. The title is 2022, War in Europe, World in Crisis, the Year Geopolitics Changed, and that will be discharged by Lord Mark Sedwell, former Cabinet Secretary and National Security Advisor, talking to Jack Straw. So thank you all very much for tuning in today. Thank you for Brian Klaas for giving up the hour to talk to us, and I wish you all a very good afternoon.